Well, as you mentioned, U.S. intelligence services are leaking a lot of this information to major media outlets. And in the past few weeks, there have been several major reports in all of the major U.S. media outlets: New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN, NBC News. All of them have published reports acknowledging that the U.S. has been losing this war. And assuming the war is coming to an end sometime soon, the U.S. lost this war, period. It is quite clear that Trump is looking for some kind of off ramp, even though he's, of course, the person who started this war. It was a war of his decision, his choice. It was totally unnecessary. This report you just mentioned, of course, is very significant, but there was another report recently in the Washington Post that acknowledged that Iran has more than 70% of its missile capabilities, and Iran has the ability to keep making more missiles and drones. It's not just a static number. So, at the same time, there are also reports that the U.S. military is actually running out of missiles. Forbes magazine published a report acknowledging that about half of the most important missiles, different kinds of missiles, including the interceptors that are needed for the THAAD air defense system and the interceptors that are used in other air defense systems, the U.S. has run out of half of those that's provided to its allies in Israel, and it will take several years for the U.S. to rebuild those stockpiles. This is a point that I've been stressing from the beginning of this war that the U.S. and Israel launched on the 28th of February, which is that the U.S. can flood these military industrial complex contractors with billions or trillions of dollars in contracts. But there are physical bottlenecks in the supply chain. And by the way, China is one of those major bottlenecks because the U.S. needs critical minerals and especially rare earth elements in order to make this advanced military technology. And China dominates the global supply chain for critical minerals and especially for rare earths. So even if the U.S. gives trillions of dollars to all of these companies, they simply had physical limitations in the supply chains as to how many weapons and systems and ammunition and missiles they can actually create in a finite period of time. So, and when you look at all of the evidence impassionately, it becomes very clear that the U.S. lost this war, and this is why even now some major war hawks in Washington, arch neoconservatives, like, for instance, Robert Kagan, who is the husband of Victoria Nuland, one of the architects of the coup in Ukraine in 2014, a top former State Department official. Robert Kagan is one of the original neocons. He's one of the co-founders of the Project for the New American Century. And he's published an article in The Atlantic, which is, the voice of Atlanticism, a pro-NATO mouthpiece. And in this article in The Atlantic, he acknowledged that the U.S. lost the war against Iran, and that this will be a massive, historic game changer, not only for West Asia, for the Middle East, but for the entire world. In that article, he acknowledged that one, this means that Iran, coming out of this war, is going to be significantly more powerful than before. Iran is going to have control over the Strait of Hormuz, the most important oil transit choke point on Earth. Iran also is going to have significant influence over the Persian Gulf monarchies. And by the way, there have been multiple reports that the UAE was directly participating in this U.S.-Israeli war. The UAE was directly bombing Iran, and Benjamin Netanyahu visited the UAE during this war. So the Gulf regimes have been entirely discredited. They never really had much credibility, but they had a lot of money, and that can go a long way when you're paying people off. But the Gulf regimes have had their credibility shredded. The illusion that they're a safe haven has been totally destroyed, and they already were unpopular among their own populations and especially among other people in the region. But now the fact that they're so clearly supporting Israel and the U.S. has only further discredited them in the eyes of the average peoples of this region, the Arab peoples, Persian, other ethnic minority groups, people from all across the region can now see that these Gulf regimes are totally fraudulent. They never cared about the Palestinian people, and they will go along with the U.S. and Israel and whatever they want, which is why, of course, Tehran targeted that. That's why, they're hosting their military bases. And then finally, Robert Kagan, getting back to this article in The Atlantic, he acknowledged that this will also accelerate the decline of U.S. global dominance. And he argued that it will be beneficial for China and Russia. It will increase their influence. I know we're going to talk about that later. So, that's just a brief overview, but if you just look at mainstream media outlets, they're all at this point now acknowledging, after more than 2 months, that this war was a total failure, that it actually strengthened Iran, it weakened the U.S., and could potentially usher in an even more multipolar global order.
Great points, Ben. And here's Donald Trump's reaction to these reports, because there have been a lot of them. And this is what he wrote. This is what I believe it was already on Air Force One, honestly, to China when he wrote this, or about to be on. He said, when the fake news says that the Iranian enemy is doing well militarily against us, it's virtual treason, and that it is such a false and even preposterous statement. They're aiding and abetting the enemy. All it does is give Iran false hope when none should exist. These are American cowards who are rooting against our country. Iran had 159 ships in their Navy. Every single one is now gone. The Navy, the Air Force is gone. All the gone. And anyway, they're losers. Everyone's a loser. And Trump is a winner. That was the response. But to your point on the Gulf allies too, like UAE, etc. Trump site just published this today that in classified CIA again. Analysis circulating this week found that Washington's Gulf allies are now split over how much military support to provide to the Trump administration's war on Iran. And of course, we had the whole fiasco of Project Freedom and all the Gulf allies, the vassals like the UAE and Saudi and Kuwait especially. They were all supposed to be on board, but it ended up being just the UAE, and everyone else said, maybe not this time. And then there were reports that they came back into it, and then they both these countries, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, said no, not really. So it's a big mess right now. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is big, and we'll start with this so-called Project Freedom or Operation Freedom, where Trump was going to try to militarily force open the Strait of Hormuz. And it was reported that Saudi Arabia denied the U.S. military access to its airspace and its bases. First of all, those bases are largely in rubble. There have been many reports acknowledging that the U.S. military bases in the region have been reduced to rubble. But why did Saudi Arabia deny the U.S. access to its airspace? Why was Saudi Arabia not interested in getting involved in this operation? I think the answer is quite clear. It's because Iran has demonstrated it has the ability to cause significant damage in these countries. We already know that billions of dollars of infrastructure have been destroyed or significantly damaged, especially energy infrastructure. We're talking about oil and natural gas. And everyone knows that these Gulf regimes are all petrostates. They only exist because they were blessed by the British Empire, then the U.S. Empire after World War II, which protected them. And they have enormous reserves of oil and natural gas, and they use that to fund everything. And they've all pretended that they're going to diversify their economies in recent years. Saudi Arabia wants to become like a tourist attraction and all these things. They've invested in assets all around the world, and not only traditional assets like stocks and bonds and real estate, but also, more unorthodox assets like sports teams. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been buying up tons of sports teams and things like that. And at the end of the day, their tourism industry has been destroyed by this war and their alliance with the U.S. and Israel. And now they're being forced to liquidate a lot of those investments because they're running massive deficits, because their oil and export revenue and gas revenue has plummeted. And even if they can produce oil and gas, they can't get it out of the Strait of Hormuz. But a lot of them cannot even produce the oil and natural gas because it's been physically destroyed in this war. Because every time the US and Israel bomb an Iranian energy site, including, the largest gas fields in Iran, as well as, energy infrastructure, and they even at one point tried to go after some of the water treatment facilities, the desalination facilities, which would be a massive escalation because then Iran could target the desalination plants in the Persian Gulf of the monarchies like Saudi Arabia, which get the vast majority of the water from these treatment plants. So at every stage, the US and Israel would escalate, and then they would hit one of these facilities in Iran. And what would Tehran do? It would hit one of the same facilities in the Persian Gulf regimes. So Saudi Arabia was the one that was actually bearing the cost of this war. The US on the other side of the world. I mean, Iran did demonstrate at this war that it has some long-range ballistic missiles. Iran was able to hit the Diego Garcia base that the US and the UK run, which is technically part of Mauritius. It goes back to an old British colony, back to the British Empire. But anyway, Diego Garcia, this base is 4,000 kilometers from Iran, and Tehran was able to hit it. But of course, the US is on the other side of the world, so Iran cannot directly hit the continental US. But what Iran can do is hit Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, Jordan, US bases in Iraq, and that's exactly what Iran did. So again, this is such a massive game changer because Iran, one, to use some international relations rhetoric, Iran has established deterrence. What does that mean? Deterrence is the ability to prevent another actor from carrying out actions that you don't like. So Iran has the ability, it has established deterrence because it has the ability to prevent the US and Israel from launching another attack against it. Because let's not forget, in June of last year, the US and Israel launched another war of aggression, known as the 12-day war. Before that, the US bombed. The US has been doing this. Israel has assassinated how many Iranian officials and nuclear scientists. Trump did this in his first term in January 2020, right before the pandemic. He assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the top Iranian general. And in those previous acts of terror by the US and Israel, Iran did not really respond significantly. It did respond in some ways, but not at the same level. And now Iran has established that it can respond at the same level. It can exact a massive price upon these countries, and therefore it has established deterrence. So Trump can say whatever he wants. It's all just propaganda. It's to try to throw red meat to his increasingly alienated base. He's alienated a lot of his former supporters who are very angry about this totally unnecessary war. And by the way, the last thing I'll say is that Forbes estimated, they cited a Harvard lecturer who estimated that this war will cost $1 trillion. $1 trillion. And what did the U.S. get out of it? They massively strengthened Iran in the war.
And one thing to note too, Ed, is when it comes to Operation Freedom and what you were just outlining there, not too long ago, less than a week ago, and this might have something to do with the reason why there are a lot of neocons, CIA, all kind of throwing water on the Trump administration war effort. Is the United States needed an Iranian tanker and in the Strait of Hormuz. And then Iran chased the warships out of the Strait of Hormuz. They claimed that they hit the warships. There was some data, satellite data, indicating that there were fires in the Persian Gulf. But nonetheless, regardless of whether they hit them or not, the U.S. hasn't hit another Iranian tanker since. And I think that outlines and underscores your point on deterrence. The U.S. is still harassing ships coming out of the Strait of Hormuz, coming out of the Persian Gulf, but they are not hitting Iranian vessels like they were trying to do, and did in that instance. So I think that really does underscore your point, Ben. But any reactions to that?
Yeah, it reminds me of what I was going to say when you were reading that stupid tweet from Trump claiming that it's all just propaganda. And by the way, he called it treason. So if you don't support his war and you publish information that demonstrates the war is not going well, you're guilty of virtual treason, according to the U.S. president, which shows his deep commitment to freedom of press and freedom of speech, right? Well, but it reminds me of another point I was going to make, where he posted that the U.S. has destroyed Iran's Navy and Air Force. First of all, Iran barely had an Air Force. They have not invested much in an Air Force. And even aside from that, there are some reports in mainstream U.S. media outlets citing U.S. intelligence that Iran, despite the fact that its Air Force is very basic and undeveloped, Iran still was able to use that Air Force to hit some of the U.S. bases in the region. But aside from that, okay, the U.S. destroyed the small number of planes that Iran had, and the U.S. destroyed Iran's traditional navy, Trump claims. But Iran's whole military strategy is based on asymmetric warfare. It's not based on having these massive aircraft carriers and these battle groups like the U.S. military strategy is. Iran's strategy is similar to that of many, formerly colonized countries in the global south fighting anti-colonial wars, like Vietnam. It is more of a kind of guerrilla war. Obviously, it's not exactly guerrilla war because they're not U.S. troops on the ground that we know of, but it's asymmetric, like what Yemen has done as well, which is based on using lots of drones, very cheap drones. These are the Shahed drones, which cost on average $10,000 to $20,000 US dollars, which are being used against missile interceptors. Interceptor missiles that cost millions of dollars for each. So Iran also has been using, tugboats as these small little boats. They doesn't have to put bombs in these boats, or mines, or cheap missiles. So Trump's like, we destroyed their military capabilities. But Iran's whole strategy is to be able to run a very low-cost war for an extended period of time using asymmetric tactics, causing significant damage against the U.S. and Israel and its allies, and being able to continue to produce these drones and missiles and such in underground facilities in the middle of nowhere at a low cost in large numbers. So this is why the U.S. lost the war. And it's another example of this arrogance in Washington. They think that Iran has the same military strategy as them, and they bombed Iran's Air Force, therefore they won the war. Or they eliminated some of the previous Iranian leadership, therefore they won the war. And again, it reflects their ignorance and their arrogance, because Trump and top U.S. officials, they drank their own Kool-Aid. They believed that all they had to do was assassinate the top Iranian leadership in so-called decapitation strikes, and the government would fall, and they would have regime change, and they could put the Shah's failed son back in power or whatever. But actually, what this war has also demonstrated is that the Iranian government has, one, popular legitimacy. I'm not saying everyone in Iran loves it, but there clearly is a solid base of support, and there have been many people out in the streets supporting their government, rallying behind the flag. Second of all, this war has demonstrated that there is a deep, not only a legitimacy, but a solidity, a firmness to this government, because the U.S. assassinated so many top officials, and they always found someone else to take their place. And there are reports that for each top position in the government, there were 4 people designated and the chain of command to fill that person's role. So this is a government that clearly has longevity. It is not fragile. It clearly has this kind of ideological legitimacy among the people who make up the government, who make up the political service, the religious leadership, and the military leadership. And it was quite easy for Iran to replace that. So once again, Trump thought this would be a quick operation. They would assassinate the leadership and have regime change. Obviously, all of that completely failed.
Yes, and a lot of the developments we're talking about now are things that Iran has been saying from the beginning of this war and the beginning of the retaliations that the aggressive attacks and war crimes committed by the U.S. and Israel, now being admitted. I mean, there was also the story not too long ago of the F-5 even with Iran saying they were using older weapons in the beginning of the war, that they were using those first because they didn't feel like they had to use the newer models of anything. Well, they used an F-5, which is like a 1950s, 60s era U.S. fighter jet that they received back during those days when they were not sovereign, when they were in between period between Moscow and the Soviet Revolution. So they received it, they used it, and they were able to hit the Kuwait, the Camp Boucher, the U.S. base in Kuwait, pretty hard with it. So, and that's from U.S. officials and those congressmen who were sitting in on these meetings. So yeah, it's. And now I'm going to get to the China visit back here in Beijing. I wanted to ask you first, before we, because the meeting is still yet to happen between the two leaders. But I want to go back to the article by David Sanger, because there's this claim, after talking about all the humiliation that Trump is going through when it comes to Iran, there's also this claim that China is going into this with being unable to come to the aid of Iran, and that it has no plan of their own to resume the vital flow of China-bound oil and gas, and that this is now a meeting that has both leaders bogged down in an uncertain Iran conflict. And I'm wondering, Ben, is there any truth to this in your assessment? It seems like there's a narrative floating around that both the United States and China are facing a similar kind of difficulties when it comes to this war.
It's so beyond projection. It's absurd. I mean, it's so funny also because many of these same media outlets have been publishing report after report about how Iran is secretly getting all this support from China. And how, I mean, a lot of this is true. China has provided Iran with access to its satellite system, which, GPS, people know GPS, it's actually a U.S. system. It's not, GPS is a proprietary technology, and it was developed by the U.S. military. China has its own GPS alternative, which is called Beidou, and Iran reportedly has been using China's satellite system in this war. China has also provided Iran with many of the components it needs to make its missiles and drones, and China has provided Iran with financial support because of U.S. sanctions on Iran. This is why just a few days ago, the Trump administration put sanctions on multiple Chinese institutions, including a major Chinese petrochemical company, HUMILIATED, and Chinese banks that were facilitating transactions with Iran and other Chinese companies. And this was, of course, in the lead up to Trump's visit to China. So, this is how the U.S. operates. Before you visit someone's home, you punch them in the face, which is what the U.S. was doing with these sanctions. And the U.S. was explicitly saying, if you read these press releases from the State Department and the Treasury, the U.S. says that they're sanctioning these Chinese institutions because they were doing business with Iran. So it's so funny because you read the media coverage and it's so schizophrenic. At one moment they say that China is doing everything it can to support Iran, China is fighting a proxy war against the U.S., and then the next one they say China's not doing anything, China has abandoned its friends, who can trust China? Now, you and I have talked about this a lot, Danny. China does not directly intervene in foreign issues, especially in military conflicts. China has not fought a war since 1979. It does not militarily intervene abroad. And when it comes to, things like Iran, China behind the scenes has been providing a lot of support, but it's not going to do so overtly because China also has good relations with the Gulf monarchies because China is the world's largest oil importer. Unlike the U.S., which is the world's largest oil producer and is a net exporter of oil, it still does import a lot, but it's a net exporter. The U.S. is actually in many ways a competitor with the Gulf regimes when it comes to oil and natural gas. The U.S. is also a major producer of liquefied natural gas, whereas China is very dependent on energy from the region. So China doesn't want to completely alienate and anger all of these Gulf regimes. And at the same time, China has played a conciliatory role trying to broker peace talks. And there are reports that China was working with Pakistan, which hosted these U.S.-Iranian talks in the capital, Islamabad. So China has been, wearing a lot of hats and playing different roles here. But China obviously has been supporting Iran in some crucial ways. Now, getting back to Trump's visit to Beijing and, the role of Iran in all of this, I think it's true that originally Trump wanted Iran to be part of his strategy to put pressure on China to make concessions. I think Trump's original strategy was that the U.S. would carry out regime change in Iran. It would supposedly be this quick and easy operation like they thought they did in Venezuela, where they kidnapped Venezuela's president Nicolas Maduro, and they did this in a few hours, and they came back, and they killed more than 100 people in Venezuela, but that part is almost never mentioned. And Trump claims that they carried out regime change. By the way, they did not carry out regime change in Venezuela. The current interim president is Delcy Rodriguez, who was the vice president, and according to the Constitution of Venezuela, she is in the presidential chain of command. She continues to govern, and it's basically the same government. Now, they have made some concessions in return for sanctions relief, but Maduro desperately wanted sanctions relief and was willing to make concessions, including he made concessions to Chevron. So it's basically the same government. And this idea is like Trump just carried out regime change and put in a puppet is completely false. But regardless, we need to keep that in mind because, of course, the U.S. invaded Venezuela less than 2 months before it attacked Iran, about 6-7 weeks before. So this is why the Iran operation, the U.S. thought it would be this quick and easy attack where they could overthrow the government and put in power a puppet, and then Trump would come into Beijing and meet with Xi, and he would have this leverage of Iran. And China does buy about 80% of Iran's oil. China has very much diversified its oil supply. Iran is not, it wouldn't be a deal breaker. It wouldn't be existential if China would not be Iranian oil. But of course, it is a major oil supplier to China. Trump wanted to come into China with that and say, look, if you don't make these concessions to us economically, then we are going to cut off Iranian oil to you, like they're trying to do to Venezuelan oil as well. Obviously, that did not work. And the U.S. lost that leverage, which is why Trump was forced to delay his meeting, his visit to China. And now he's coming to China empty-handed on the Iran issue. The U.S. has leverage in some areas, but certainly when it comes to Iran, that is a strategy that did not work at all, and you can say it backfired. Now, this brings me to another aspect of this China trip, which, some people have asked me, and I like this question. They asked me, why do you think China wanted Trump to visit? And I say, no, you had it backward. It was Trump that wanted to meet with President Xi. It was Trump that wanted to come to China. It's not China that was begging for this meeting. It was the U.S. that was asking for this meeting. And I think there are a few very clear reasons for this. One of them, I don't know if you can I share my screen, Benny?
I think so, but if you can't, just send me the link if you want.
I think I can. Perfect. All right, I just want to get out this post from, can you see this?
I can add it to the stage right now. Here we go.
Yeah, okay. So this is from Trump in his Twitter copy website, Truth Social. This is the main reason why he wanted this China trip. And he posted in this post that he's visiting China with the following CEOs and major, billionaire oligarchs. Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, which is now the most valuable company on Earth. It has a market capitalization of more than $4 trillion. Elon Musk, he just calls Tim Apple. That's so funny. Tim Cook, who is the CEO of Pixar.
I just noticed that. That's really funny.
Tim Apple is that. Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock. the biggest asset manager on earth, Stephen Schwarzman, who is the CEO of Blackstone, the biggest alternative asset manager on earth, along with the CEOs of Boeing, Cargill, Citigroup, GD Aerospace, Goldman Sachs, Micron, and Qualcomm. This is the main reason why Trump wanted this trip. It's because China is one of the biggest countries on earth in terms of population. It's the second biggest, 1.4 billion people. China has a massive internal market. It has the biggest economy on earth when you measure GDP and purchasing power parity. And the U.S. previously did a lot of trade with China until Trump started the trade war in his first term, and Biden did continue that trade war. And then Trump massively expanded it now in his second term last year, and at one point threatened tariffs of 140% against China. Obviously, that all backfired because China demonstrated that it has significant leverage that it could use, especially the issue of critical minerals and rare earth elements, because China restricted the export of rare earths to the U.S., and rare earths are needed by big tech corporations, their products, and the military industrial complex for the weapon systems the U.S. creates. So by restricting these rare earths, China was able to paralyze many parts of the U.S. economy, and it forced the U.S. to back off on these sky-high tariffs. China also has many other points of leverage. So, both sides have some cards they can play. Trump and Scott Bessent will constantly claim, we don't have all the cards. But in reality, what China demonstrated last year is it has many more cards than the U.S. So Trump is now, he's the one who wanted this meeting. He's coming to Beijing, and he's trying to come to some kind of new trade agreement to try to reverse the devastating impact of the trade war that he started and the tariffs that he proposed, which have backfired on the U.S. economy. They've also fueled inflation, of course, because the U.S. imports so many consumer goods from China. And one of the reasons why there was relatively low consumer price inflation in the past 20 years in the U.S. Of course, there was very high rates of asset price inflation, which has made, real estate unaffordable for most people. But in terms of consumer price inflation, especially things like electronics and furniture and, household appliances and, things we use in our daily life, a big reason why those goods became so affordable is because of China. China was producing them at low cost and building its massive supply chain, moving up the value chain, and the U.S. benefited from those very low-cost goods, which helped to reduce inflation. And now that the U.S. has been tariffing a lot of Chinese exports and waging this trade war, this has caused significant damage to the U.S. economy. So that's the most important factor here. That's why Trump won this meeting. Of course, there are some other factors. Another is Trump wants to portray this as a victory to his base at home. Of course, the midterm election is coming up in November, and Trump is extremely unpopular. He's alienated a lot of his supporters, and he really desperately wants to claim some kind of victory. So he will probably say that China did this and China did that, and supposedly trying to make some concession. You won't be able to trust what he says, but he wants to claim some kind of victory. He wants to say, I went to China and I got this for you all, the American people, and it's going to reduce inflation supposedly and help kickstart the economy supposedly or whatever. He's going to say some big number about China promising investment of some big number and trade. And this is what he's done with Japan and Europe. And it never actually comes to fruition and never actually materializes, but this is something that he wants to do for his supporters at home. And then another big aspect of this year is that Trump really wants China to try to go along with him with, he has this idea of a G2, and China is completely opposed to this. But basically, he's like, look, the U.S. and China are the most powerful countries, so we should basically just work together to carve up the world and divide the world. And he says Latin America belongs to us and we'll do whatever we want. It's that very colonial mentality. This is not how China sees the world at all. China has publicly said it is completely against this idea of a G2 and does not want like imperial spheres of influence or whatever. So I think Trump is going into this China trip with all these things in mind about what he would like to do and what he thinks he can pressure China to do. But I think the Chinese will be very polite and very diplomatic, as they always are. They're always willing to meet with the U.S., and it's the U.S. that's usually not willing to meet with them. This is a rare exception. This is the first trip by a U.S. president since 2017 in nearly 10 years. They will be very polite, and the Chinese will certainly tell Trump something that he wants to hear. But like I said, I don't expect any alleged deals announced to actually be that significant. I think Trump will probably exaggerate it, like he's exaggerated in previous deals. And I think this is more kind of a more diplomatic meeting, more kind of political than it is going to actually result in like some major trade agreement, which is what Trump thinks he could do, but they don't have the leverage to do that.
In my view, then Norton's analysis highlights the growing strategic crisis for the United States in the Middle East, while Iran is increasingly demonstrating its military deterrence capabilities. Trump's lock and loaded rhetoric may sound aggressive, but in reality it reflects Washington's mounting pressure and strategic deadlock. What stands out even more is that China no longer appears willing to bend under U.S. pressure as easily as before. Instead of being isolated, Beijing is emerging as a major global power with growing influence, leaving Trump politically and economically cornered on multiple fronts. I believe that the more military escalation continues, the more the United States risks damaging its own economy, credibility, and global stand. The world is changing rapidly, and the era of uncontested American dominance is no longer as strong as it once was. What do you think? Does the U.S. still have the ability to impose its will on the Middle East and China the way it once did?
Changes very much